Welcome to BookTone, where Buddha's timeless wisdom meets your everyday life. Here, we explore deep truths, mindful living, and the path to inner peace, one word, one breath, one moment at a time. Subscribe and begin your journey inward. What Buddha says is not merely a collection of moral instructions or spiritual aphorisms, but an all-encompassing path to freedom from suffering, a psychology of awakening, a philosophy grounded in compassionate realism, and a profound invitation to know the mind, transcend ignorance, and taste the ultimate peace called nirvana. And when we look at what Buddha truly says, stripped of myth, dogma, or later cultural overlays, we find an elegant system, rooted in direct experience and personal insight, beginning with the Four Noble Truths, where he calmly declared the reality that life, as it is ordinarily lived, is dukkha, often translated as suffering, but more subtly referring to the persistent dissatisfaction, restlessness, or incompleteness that haunts even the most fortunate of lives. And Buddha does not say this to induce pessimism, but to inspire clarity. Because the first noble truth is not a denial of joy, but a piercing recognition that even joy, when clung to, can bring sorrow. And the second truth, the cause of dukkha, lies not in the world, but in craving, tanha, the insatiable thirst of the egoic mind which grasps, rejects, resists, and demands. And this craving includes not just physical desires but also attachments to views, identities, emotions, and the illusion of permanence. And the third truth is the liberation from dukkha, the cessation of this craving, which leads to nibbana or nirvana, not a place, but a state of unshakable freedom, peace, and clarity. And the fourth noble truth is the path that leads to this end, the Noble Eightfold Path, which is not a sequence, but a harmonious set of interwoven practices that cultivate ethical conduct, mental discipline, and wisdom, beginning with right view, understanding reality as it is, particularly the truths of impermanence, suffering, and not-self, and followed by right intention, cultivating thoughts of renunciation, goodwill, and harmlessness, then right speech, avoiding lies, divisive talk, harsh words, and idle chatter, right action, refraining from killing, stealing, and sexual misconduct, right livelihood, earning a living without harming others, right effort, abandoning unwholesome states and cultivating wholesome ones, right mindfulness, maintaining awareness of body, feelings, mind, and mental objects, and right concentration, deepening the mind through meditative absorption or jhana. And what Buddha says through these teachings is that liberation is possible here and now through diligent effort and clear seeing. And he does not ask us to believe blindly, but to come and see ehipasiko, a core Pali term that invites personal investigation, because the Dharma, as he taught, is visible, timeless, and immediately effective for those who practice it sincerely. And to support this path, he emphasized the 5 precepts, not commandments, but trainings in non-harming, to refrain from killing, stealing, sexual misconduct, false speech, and intoxicants that cloud the mind, because ethical living creates the foundation of inner peace, a mind not tormented by guilt or agitation. And what Buddha repeatedly says is that the root of our suffering lies not in outer circumstances, but in how we relate to experience. And that by training the mind, we can uproot the tendencies that keep us bound, greed, hatred, and delusion, and replace them with their antidotes, generosity, compassion, and wisdom. And this inner transformation is not abstract. It begins with the breath, the body, and the present moment. And this is why Buddha taught mindfulness so emphatically, establishing the Satipatthana Sutta, the discourse on the 4 foundations of mindfulness, as the direct path to purification of beings, the overcoming of sorrow and lamentation, the disappearance of pain and grief, and the attainment of nibbana. And in this discourse, he encourages us to observe the body as body, feelings as feelings, mind as mind, and mental objects as mental objects, without clinging, judgment, or identification. And this deep seeing leads to insight into the three characteristics of all conditioned things: anicca, impermanence; dukkha, unsatisfactoriness; and anatta, not self. And by contemplating these, we loosen the grip of attachment and begin to dwell in freedom. And Buddha says, again and again, that wisdom is not intellectual, it is experiential, arising from direct contemplation of reality as it unfolds moment to moment. And he distinguishes between mundane understanding and liberating insight, vipassana, which cuts through illusion like a sword. And he teaches that this path is open to all, regardless of caste, status, or gender, and his rejection of the rigid Brahmanical hierarchy of ancient India was revolutionary, offering monastic ordination to women and encouraging laypeople to practice deeply. And when he speaks of karma, he is not invoking fatalism, but cause and effect, the simple law that wholesome actions bring happiness and unwholesome ones bring suffering, and that by purifying our actions, speech, and thought, we shape our future not only in this life, but in the cycles to come. Yet even rebirth, he says, is not eternal. The goal is to transcend the wheel of samsara entirely through enlightenment. And in this awakened state, the mind is no longer bound by craving, aversion, or ignorance, but rests in deep equanimity and boundless compassion. And what Buddha says again and again is that the path to awakening is walked step by step through daily effort, reflection, and letting go, not by clinging to rituals or external authorities, but by knowing the truth within ourselves. And in the Kalam Sutta, he famously urges us not to accept teachings out of tradition, scripture, or hearsay, but to test them in the fire of our own experience, adopting what leads to welfare, happiness, and liberation, and rejecting what leads to harm, bondage, and suffering. And this pragmatic spirit pervades all his teachings, making Buddhism not just a religion, but a way of life rooted in awareness, kindness, and inner freedom. And he speaks with tenderness about compassion, the heart quality known as karuna, saying that the wise person cultivates loving kindness, metta, not only toward friends, but toward enemies, strangers, and all beings without discrimination, and that this boundless love is not weakness but strength, the mark of a truly awakened being. And he encourages us to contemplate the brevity of life, the inevitability of death, not to despair, but to live fully, to awaken before it is too late, to use our rare human birth to cultivate virtue, meditation, and wisdom. And he compares the mind to a monkey, restless and wild, but also to a garden capable of blooming with beauty when tended with care. And he speaks often of the middle way, not indulging in sensual pleasure, no torturing the body, but walking the path of balance, simplicity, and clarity. And even in silence, what Buddha says resounds: his presence, his equanimity, his compassion radiated like a beacon. And long after his physical passing, his words remain as a guide for those who seek truth beyond belief, peace beyond pleasure, and liberation beyond identity. And so what Buddha says, in essence, is wake up, see things as they are. Let go of what causes pain, cultivate what brings peace, live ethically, mindfully, and wisely. And know that you are not broken, not damaged, not doomed, but capable of awakening, of freedom, of love that has no boundaries. And when we truly hear what Buddha says, not just in words, but in stillness, in practice, in our own unfolding awareness, we discover that the path is not far. It begins right where we are, with this breath, this body, this mind, and the gentle but radical recognition that suffering is optional. Freedom is near, and awakening is possible for anyone who dares to look within. And as we continue to listen deeply to what Buddha says, not merely through words written in ancient texts, but through the quiet teachings of breath, silence, compassion, and present moment awareness, we realize that he was not offering dogma to be recited, but tools to be practiced, refined, and embodied in daily life, and that every teaching he gave was ultimately aimed at freedom from suffering, not in some distant future or mythical heaven, but here, Now, in this very moment of human experience, and among his many insights, Buddha continually emphasized the impermanence of all things, not to induce fear, but to awaken presence, reminding us that clinging to what is constantly changing, whether people, possessions, status, beauty, or even ideas, is the root of suffering, because what we grasp, we fear to lose, and what we fear to lose, we bind to our identity. But the truth he points to is that there is no fixed self to possess or lose. And in realizing this, we begin to understand the profound wisdom of anatta, or not self, a cornerstone of his teachings, which liberates us from the illusion of ego, the false notion that there is a permanent, unchanging I at the center of experience. And this insight, though initially unsettling, becomes deeply freeing, because when there is no rigid self to defend, promote, or protect, we are free to respond to life with openness, kindness, and equanimity. And Buddha doesn't stop there. He urges us to see anicca, or impermanence, in all phenomena, recognizing that what arises will pass away, and that suffering comes not from the arising or the passing, but from our resistance to this natural flow. And when we begin to accept impermanence as a truth, not just intellectually but experientially, we begin to soften our grip on life, to open to change, to embrace what comes and let go of what leaves. And in doing so, we taste a deeper peace, one that is not dependent on circumstances. And what Buddha says through these truths is not a rejection of the world, but a clear seeing of how it works, and how we can live in it skillfully, with compassion, clarity, and wisdom. And when it comes to compassion, Buddha's teachings shine brightest, for he taught that true awakening is incomplete without an open heart, and that the enlightened mind naturally responds to suffering not with indifference, but with boundless love. And thus he taught the Brahma Viharas, or the four immeasurables: metta, loving-kindness; karuna, compassion; mudita, sympathetic joy; and upeksha, equanimity, as qualities to be cultivated in our thoughts, speech, and actions. And these heart practices are not merely nice ideas, but powerful tools for inner transformation, dissolving hatred, jealousy, pride, and fear, and bringing about a mind that is balanced, forgiving, and free. And Buddha repeatedly said that just as a mother protects her only child with her life, so should we cultivate a heart that embraces all beings with unconditional kindness, even those who harm us. For to hate is to carry the burden of suffering within, and to forgive is to release that burden and return to freedom. And this compassion is not weak or passive, it is fierce, steady, and wise, grounded in a deep understanding of our shared humanity and the universal wish to be free from pain. And it is this very recognition that all beings wish to be happy that forms the ethical foundation of Buddhist morality, which is not based on reward or punishment, but on the awareness that our actions have consequences, and that a life lived with integrity and awareness naturally leads to peace, while a life driven by greed, hatred, or delusion leads to confusion and suffering. And thus Buddha encourages us to live mindfully, to be aware not just of our breath or body, but of the intentions behind our actions, the tone of our speech, the quality of our thoughts, and to constantly refine ourselves through self-awareness, not with harsh judgment, but with gentle persistence, like a craftsman shaping a sculpture with care. And through this process of inner training, we begin to move from reactivity to response, from unconscious habit to deliberate presence. And Buddha says this is the true freedom, not being free to do whatever we want, but being free from the compulsions that once drove us blindly. And when we understand this, we begin to appreciate the beauty of silence, which Buddha often used not as a withdrawal, but as a teaching in itself, reminding us that sometimes the deepest truths are not spoken but realized in stillness. And in this silence, the noise of the ego subsides, and what remains is a clarity untouched by thought, a direct knowing that transcends language. And in this space, we begin to understand what nirvana truly is, not an escape, but a return, a homecoming, to the natural state of the mind when it is free from craving, aversion, and delusion. And what Buddha says about nirvana is both subtle and profound. It is the unborn, unconditioned, unmade, and therefore the ultimate refuge, beyond the cycles of birth and death, beyond time and space, and yet accessible through mindful presence and inner purification. And this promise of liberation is open to all, not just monks or scholars, but to anyone willing to walk the path with sincerity, diligence, and humility. And throughout his life, Buddha emphasized the importance of direct experience, urging his followers not to rely solely on tradition, teachers, or texts, but to test the teachings in their own lives, to see for themselves the truth of the path. And this empirical spirit is what makes his teachings timeless, adaptable to any culture or era, and relevant in today's world of chaos, consumerism, and distraction. And in the modern age, what Buddha says remains a sanctuary, a guide for living with awareness in a world addicted to speed, for cultivating compassion in the face of division, for finding clarity amidst confusion, and for discovering peace that is not dependent on circumstances. And when we truly sit with his teachings, not just as ideas, but as invitations, we begin to taste the fruit of the path. A mind that is quiet yet alert, a heart that is open yet strong, and a life that is simple yet rich in meaning. And thus, to follow what Buddha says is not to follow a religion in the conventional sense, but to engage in a radical act of presence, of remembering our true nature, and of living in harmony with the laws of reality, not resisting what is, but dancing with it, like a leaf floating on the stream, responsive yet free. And as we go deeper, we begin to see that what Buddha says is not merely about suffering and its end, but about how to live in each moment with wisdom, love, and courage, and how to die without regret, having lived a life aligned with truth. And in the end, when asked to summarize his teachings, Buddha simply said, "Avoid evil, cultivate good, and purify the mind." This is the teaching of all Buddha. And in that simplicity lies a universe of practice, transformation, and awakening. And as we journey further into the vast and compassionate ocean of what Buddha says, we come to understand that his teachings are not only instructions, but reflections of a deep inner knowing and awakened awareness that sees things as they truly are, not as we wish or fear them to be, but in their raw, luminous impermanence. And through this lens of clarity, we begin to see that everything Buddha ever spoke was aimed at helping beings wake up from the dream of separateness, to dissolve the illusion that we are alone, isolated minds battling against a chaotic world, and instead realize that all of life is deeply interconnected, that our happiness is bound to the happiness of others, and that true freedom arises not from selfish escape, but from compassionate engagement. And so Buddha taught not only the inner path of meditation and mindfulness, but also the outer path of wise relationship, of right speech, right action, and right livelihood, not as moral obligations, but as natural expressions of a heart unclouded by delusion. And again, what Buddha says points back to the middle way, the sacred balance between indulgence and repression, between spiritual ambition and self-acceptance, between renunciation and joy, a way of walking through life with presence, with open eyes and open heart, where each step becomes both the path and the destination. And as we continue to reflect on what Buddha says, we begin to notice the subtle shifts within us. A growing spaciousness in the face of conflict, a softening of judgment, a willingness to pause before reacting, to listen before speaking, to forgive before resentment takes root. And it is in these small inner revolutions that the teachings become real, not in theory, but in lived transformation. And this is why Buddha placed such emphasis on direct realization, on practice, not performance, urging his disciples to meditate not to escape life, but to meet it fully, to observe each sensation, each emotion, each thought as it arises and passes, and to see within that rising and passing the truth of anicca, impermanence, and anatta, not self, and dukkha, unsatisfactoriness. And in seeing those clearly, not with fear, but with wisdom, the heart begins to unbind itself from suffering, not because pain disappears, but because we no longer cling to it. And this insight is the heart of the path. That freedom is not found in controlling life, but in understanding and releasing our compulsive grasping toward it. And Buddha never demanded belief, he invited inquiry. And in this spirit of fearless investigation, he taught the 4 foundations of mindfulness as a direct path to awakening, encouraging practitioners to observe the body, feelings, mind, and mental objects with bare attention without judgment or identification, and in doing so, to penetrate through appearances and taste the timeless reality beneath. And he reminded us that we already possess the seeds of enlightenment, that we need not seek outside what is already inside, like a lotus blooming from muddy waters, or a mirror shining once the dust is cleared. And in his vast compassion, Buddha addressed all types of minds, from kings and scholars to beggars and murderers, with the same message. Transformation is possible, no matter your past, your pain, your confusion, if you are willing to look deeply and walk the path with sincerity. And this path is not always easy, it demands courage, honesty, and patience. But it is always possible, always available, in this very breath. And again Buddha reminded his followers, you are your own refuge, meaning that no savior, priest, or guru can walk the path for you, that ultimate freedom is not given, it is realized, cultivated through effort, through ethical living, meditation, and insight. And as we absorb what Buddha says, we realize that it is less about adding something to our lives and more about letting go of ego, of greed, of fear, of clinging to what cannot last. And that in this letting go, we do not become less, but more spacious, more peaceful, more alive. And so his teachings are not ascetic rules, but a map to liberation, a blueprint for awakening in the midst of birth and death, joy and sorrow, noise and stillness. And what makes Buddha's words eternal is not only their clarity, but their deep compassion. They do not shame us for being human. They invite us to understand what it means to be fully human, to embrace both our suffering and our potential for awakening, to recognize that even the most painful moments can be transformed into fuel for the journey. And this transformation is not just for the individual, but for the world, because as each person awakens, the world becomes a little more peaceful, more just, more kind. And this is why Buddha's teachings emphasize Sangha, the community, the importance of walking the path together, supporting one another with kindness, truth, and shared aspiration, for although the journey is inward, it is not solitary, and the ripple effects of one awakened heart are immeasurable. And in this way, what Buddha says is both profoundly intimate and universally relevant. It speaks to your suffering and mine, to your hopes, your questions, your longing for meaning, and it offers not answers, but tools, not beliefs, but practices. And through these practices, meditation, mindfulness, loving kindness, ethical living, we become not followers but awakeners, not believers but knowers. And this knowing is not conceptual. It is felt in the marrow of the bones, in the silence of a clear mind, in the stillness of the present moment. And when we touch that stillness, we begin to understand the true meaning of Buddha's smile, a smile that reflects not blissful ignorance, but radiant understanding, not detachment from the world, but freedom within it. And as we keep listening to what Buddha says, we realize that his teachings are not bound by language, culture, or time. They are universal truths, echoing in every open heart, pointing us home again and again, back to this breath, this body, this moment, where awakening is always waiting. And so, as the echoes of what Buddha says continue to unfold across centuries, across cultures, and across the deeply personal landscapes of our inner lives, we come to understand that these teachings are not merely historical artifacts or sacred texts locked in monasteries. They are living truths, waiting patiently to be rediscovered in the heart of each moment, and the quiet spaces between thoughts, in the stillness beneath the noise of everyday life. His voice speaks not in commands, but in invitations to pause, to observe, to question, to awaken. And this awakening is not some mystical event reserved for saints or sages, but the natural unfolding of awareness that happens whenever we let go of illusions and touch reality as it truly is, free from projection, expectation, or denial. And again, Buddha calls us inward, not to withdraw from the world, but to see it more clearly, to see the way we create suffering through our habitual patterns of clinging and aversion, of chasing what we believe will complete us and rejecting what we think threatens us. And in doing so, we begin to notice the subtle dance of the mind, the arising of a thought, the sensation of a breath, the momentary flicker of an emotion. And in this noticing, this bare attention, lies the seed of transformation. Because what we observe clearly we no longer identify with. And what we no longer identify with, we are free from. And thus freedom comes not from rearranging the outer world, but from liberating the mind's relationship to it. And what Buddha says about this freedom is radical. It is not something to be earned or achieved, but something to be realized as already present once the veils of ignorance are lifted. And this ignorance, avidya, is not stupidity but misperception, the deeply rooted habit of seeing permanence where there is change, satisfaction where there is frustration, and self where there is process. And through the lens of wisdom, panna, we begin to see clearly. And with that clarity comes compassion, not as an emotion, but as a natural response to suffering. And when we truly understand the shared nature of dukkha, the universal vulnerability of all beings, we cannot help but soften, forgive, open, and extend the same kindness to others that we once reserved only for ourselves or for those we deemed deserving. And in this way, what Buddha says becomes not only a path to individual liberation, but a blueprint for a more awakened world, a world where people listen with presence, speak with care, act with integrity, and live with a sense of sacred responsibility for all life. And he makes it clear that true practice is not confined to caves or temples, it is lived in marketplaces, homes, hospitals, prisons, classrooms, and battlefields. Wherever there is life, there is the potential for awakening. And thus every breath becomes an opportunity, every difficulty a teacher, every joy a moment of gratitude, and every relationship a mirror reflecting our own mind. And so the Dharma is not something separate from us, it is the very fabric of reality, the law of cause and effect, the nature of impermanence, the flow of birth and death. And to walk the path is not to escape this reality, but to align with it so deeply that we are no longer fighting life, but flowing with it, surrendered but not passive, awake but not clinging, compassionate but not entangled. And what Buddha says continues to whisper through time, be a lamp unto yourself, meaning trust the clarity that arises through practice, through direct seeing, through silence and stillness and honest reflection, and with that inner light. Navigate the path not as a follower of dogma, but as a discoverer of truth, a cultivator of wisdom, a messenger of peace. And it becomes increasingly clear that what Buddha ultimately offers us is not just a way out of suffering, but a way into a deeper, more meaningful, more compassionate way of being, one that transcends beliefs and enters the realm of lived truth. And as we mature in our understanding, we stop seeking quick fixes or external validation, and instead learn to rest in the simplicity of the present moment, when nothing needs to be added or removed for peace to be here. And in that resting, the seeds of awakening bloom, not as fireworks, but as a quiet, unshakable peace that no success or failure can touch. And so the question is no longer what can we get from life, but how can we serve, how can we love more fully, how can we see more clearly. And in that shift, the teachings come alive, not as philosophy, but as breath, as action, as intention, as love. And this is the essence of what Buddha says, that we are not separate, that we are not broken, that we are not powerless, and that within each moment, the gate to freedom swings open, not in some future moment, but right now, in the very heart of our lived, imperfect, beautiful human experience. And as we continue to open ourselves to what Buddha says, not with hurried minds seeking quick answers, but with the patience and humility of sincere seekers, we begin to realize that his words are not fixed instructions but living insights meant to be absorbed, questioned, experienced, and ultimately embodied in the silent knowing of our own direct awakening. For Buddha never claimed to be a god or a supernatural being, but rather a man who discovered a profound truth, that liberation is possible, that the chains of suffering are not eternal, and that through ethical living, mental training, and deep wisdom, we can walk the same path to freedom, not by worshipping him, but by awakening in ourselves the same clarity and compassion that he exemplified. And so what Buddha says becomes not a doctrine to be recited, but a path to be walked, where each step is grounded in mindfulness, each breath is an invitation to return to presence, and each moment, no matter how painful or ordinary, is a sacred doorway into insight. And he reminds us, through every teaching, that we are not our thoughts, not our emotions, not our past, not our fears, but something far more spacious and luminous, something that cannot be grasped but can be lived. And this is the essence of the Dharma, a return to naturalness, to simplicity, to truth as it is, stripped of illusion, clothed in stillness, and radiating with compassion for all beings. And in this journey, what we leave behind is not the world, but our resistance to it. Not desire itself, but the craving that poisons it. Not the self, but the delusion of separateness. And through this surrender, not as defeat, but as wisdom, we discover a freedom that has no opposite, a joy that is not dependent on gain or loss, and a love that extends even to those who cause harm, not because we condone the harm, but because we understand the suffering behind it. And in this way, what Buddha says touches every aspect of our lives: how we eat, how we speak, how we think, how we rest, how we respond to injustice, how we grieve, how we celebrate. And rather than offering rigid rules, he offers principles that guide us toward the middle path, a way of being that avoids both indulgence and denial, both apathy and attachment. And as we practice, we begin to taste its fruit. Fewer regrets, more clarity, more presence, and a kind of grounded peace that holds even our suffering with tenderness. And so the journey becomes less about fixing ourselves and more about seeing clearly, less about attaining and more about understanding. And with each insight, whether from formal meditation or from a moment of unexpected stillness in daily life, we begin to trust the path more deeply, knowing that freedom is not elsewhere, but here, in this very body, this very breath, this ever-unfolding now. And what Buddha says in his silence is just as powerful as his speech, that there is no need to hurry, no one to impress, nothing to become, only the timeless invitation to wake up, to love, to be. And in that awakening, we find not detachment from the world, but a deeper intimacy. With it, a willingness to face its joys and sorrows without turning away, a strength that comes not from control but from surrender. And in this way, every person who practices the Dharma becomes a quiet revolution, a light in a world that so often forgets its own luminosity. And so what Buddha says continues, not in temples alone, but in kitchens, forests, subways, bedrooms, and marketplaces, wherever one person chooses to pause, to breathe, to act with kindness, to listen with awareness, to live with truth. And the power of this cannot be overstated, for in a world spinning with distraction and division, the simple act of mindfulness is an act of peace, the simple gesture of compassion is a healing balm, and the simple choice to walk the path is a profound declaration that suffering is not the end of the story, that we are not helpless victims of our conditioning, and that we can live, love, and die with grace, grounded in a wisdom that sees through illusion and a heart that remains open to all doubt. And as we remain with what Buddha says, listening beyond the words into the silences they hold, we begin to recognize that the depth of his wisdom lies not in complexity, but in the gentle simplicity with which he reveals the most profound truths of life. For it is not through complicated rituals or philosophical debates that liberation is reached, but through consistent, honest, present awareness of what is arising in this moment. And Buddha's message is rooted in directness, not abstraction. He teaches us to see clearly, feel fully, act wisely, and speak truthfully, and in doing so, to uncover the layers of fear, confusion, and ignorance that obscure our natural clarity. And in this uncovering, we do not become someone else, but we rediscover the peaceful, compassionate presence that has always been quietly waiting beneath the turbulence of thought and emotion. And so when Buddha speaks of suffering, he is not condemning life, but illuminating its patterns, shining a light on the habits that bind us, our craving for pleasure, our aversion to pain, our clinging to identities and ideals, and offering us not condemnation, but a way to move beyond them. And in this movement, the heart begins to soften, to open, to feel again, not with overwhelm, but with presence. And we begin to notice beauty, not in extraordinary experiences, but in ordinary ones, in a quiet sunrise, a sincere breath, a shared silence, a compassionate gesture. And we see that awakening is not found only on distant mountain tops or in ancient texts, but here, in how we respond to this very moment. And so what Buddha says becomes not a distant teaching, but an intimate companion, walking with us through our challenges, our doubts, our grief, and our joy, constantly whispering reminders to come back to this breath, this step, this choice. And as we come back again and again, we begin to see how much of our suffering is not caused by life itself, but by our resistance to it, by our stories about what should or shouldn't be. And we realize that freedom does not require perfect circumstances, but a mind that no longer clings to them. And in that realization, we begin to live differently, not with apathy, but with deep care, not with passivity, but with balanced engagement. And this is the quiet miracle of the path. It turns ordinary life into sacred ground, where every moment offers the chance to see, to let go, to love, and to wake up. And in this waking, we begin to feel the compassion that the Buddha so often spoke of, not as a concept, but as an impulse from the heart, an effortless caring that extends beyond self, beyond tribe, beyond even species, to encompass all beings. Because when we see clearly, we see that all beings wish to be happy, all beings suffer, and all beings deserve kindness. And so what Buddha says calls us not just to meditate, but to live in a way that uplifts others, that harms none, and that respects the preciousness of life in all its forms. And as our practice deepens, we discover that letting go is not a loss, but a liberation, that non-attachment does not mean indifference, but loving without clinging, and that true strength is not in controlling others, but in mastering our own minds. And Buddha taught that the mind is the foreigner of all things, that with our thoughts, we make the world. And as we cultivate wholesome thoughts of kindness, patience, clarity, and generosity, we begin to see how those inner qualities ripple outward, shaping our relationships, our work, our communities, and eventually the world. And thus the personal becomes profoundly political, for the transformation of society begins with the transformation of the individual. And this is not a small promise, but a revolutionary one, that by understanding and freeing our own hearts, we contribute to the healing of all beings. And so Buddha's path is both inward and outward, both still and active, both reflective and responsive. And it asks of us a devotion not to beliefs, but to truth, not to form, but to function, not to appearance, but to essence. And as we continue to walk this path, we discover that the true miracle is not walking on water or flying in the air, but walking on the earth with awareness, with compassion, with deep appreciation for the fleeting beauty of this life. And in that walking, what Buddha says becomes our own voice, soft, honest, unwavering, a voice that reminds us that freedom is not in the future, not in another world, not in someone else's approval, but here, now, within this very moment of being alive. And as we continue to walk gently beside the timeless teachings of what Buddha says, it becomes ever clearer that his message is not something meant to be admired from a distance, but something to be lived, breathed, tested, and proven in the crucible of daily life, because it is in the ordinary struggles and triumphs of existence that the truth of the Dharma reveals itself most vividly, not in mystical visions or abstract theology, but in how we meet pain without bitterness, how we meet joy without grasping, and how we remain upright and compassionate amid the shifting winds of fortune. And the more deeply we listen to what Buddha says, the more we realize that true wisdom is not loud or forceful but quiet, patient, and deeply rooted, like a tree that stands calmly through seasons of rain and drought, offering shelter to all who seek its shade. And this is what the Buddha meant when he spoke of equanimity, upeksha, the balanced mind that neither clings to gain nor crumbles in loss, that neither exalts in praise nor withers in blame. And it is from this steadiness that true compassion arises, not as sentimentality, but as the natural response of a mind free from self-centered delusion. And so what Buddha says about compassion is not just to feel it, but to embody it, to let it guide our speech, our choices, and even our silence. For in a world so often shaped by fear and division, the presence of a person who lives compassionately becomes a powerful balm, a living testimony to the possibility of peace. And as we continue to reflect on what Buddha says, we come to appreciate the profound practicality of his teachings, how he never asked his followers to believe without understanding, but always encouraged investigation, asking questions, and verifying truths in direct experience, because he knew that borrowed faith can crumble, but realized truth endures. And so he urged us to come and see ehipasiko, to not take his word blindly, but to practice and see for ourselves what leads to suffering and what leads to its end. And in this spirit, meditation becomes not an escape, but a laboratory of awareness, where we observe the mind without judgment, learning to recognize its patterns, its tricks, its fears, and slowly, lovingly, we begin to untangle the knots of confusion that once seemed so permanent, and in their place, we discover spaciousness, insight, and a compassion that no longer needs a reason to love, because it has seen the shared nature of all beings. And what Buddha says about this interconnectedness is not just poetic, it is revolutionary, for in truly seeing the emptiness of a separate self, we dissolve the illusion that justifies greed, hatred, and delusion, and we begin to live from a place of unity, where the well-being of others becomes inseparable from our own. And this is the ground of ethics, not imposed rules, but the spontaneous expression of a heart that has remembered its original nature, a nature not of sin or defect, but of awareness, dignity, and boundless kindness. And even in his final words, as he lay on his deathbed, the Buddha did not command obedience or erect a religion. He simply said, "Be a light unto yourselves, work out your liberation with diligence." And in those words, we find the entire path. The empowerment to walk it ourselves, the responsibility to be honest and compassionate, and the encouragement to not delay, for time passes swiftly, and the opportunity for awakening is always now. And so what Buddha says continues to shine as a light in dark places, not as a dogma, but as a path of inner discovery, not as a relic of history, but as a living truth accessible to anyone with a sincere heart and a willingness to look within. And whether we are young or old, scholar or beginner, joyful or broken, the Dharma does not discriminate. It simply meets us where we are, inviting us to wake up gently, breath by breath, step by step, with courage and care. And the more we walk this path, the more we come to see that the real treasures of life are not fame, wealth, or status, but peace of mind, freedom from fear, and the ability to love without conditions. And these are the gifts Buddha offers us, not as rewards, but as the natural fruit of right understanding, right effort, and right view, cultivated over time with humility and patience. And as we live into this truth, we become not followers of Buddha, but mirrors of the same awakening, examples of what is possible when we let go of delusion and come home to what is real. And in this way, each of us becomes a continuation of the Buddha's teaching, not through preaching, but through presence, through the quality of our silence, the depth of our gaze, the softness of our heart, and the steadiness of our mind. And this is the great gift and great responsibility of hearing what Buddha says, that once we know, we cannot unknow. Once we see, we cannot unsee. And once we begin to awaken, the path calls us onward, not toward a destination, but toward a deeper presence with every step we take. And as we keep moving with what Buddha says, it becomes increasingly evident that his words are not confined to the past or bound to parchment. They live in our awareness, echoing in the stillness between breaths, in the quiet moments where we choose understanding over reaction, patience over haste, and compassion over judgment. And in those choices, however small, we come into direct contact with the path of awakening, not as an ideal, but as a living, breathing experience that brings presence to the ordinary, light to confusion, and clarity to the chaos of our inner and outer worlds. And Buddha's teachings become not something we follow like a trail, but something we embody like a pulse, beating quietly in how we walk, how we see others, how we hold suffering without collapsing under it, how we smile not because everything is perfect, but because we are no longer enslaved by perfection. And this is the essence of what Buddha says, that peace is not found in escaping life's messiness, but in understanding it deeply, compassionately, without needing to fix or control it. And so each moment becomes a gate, each breath, each silence, each challenge, a threshold to wake up a little more, to release a little more, to love a little more. And through this letting go, not of life, but of delusion, we discover that the awakened state is not a place, but a way of seeing, a way of being so completely attuned to the truth that suffering begins to lose its hold, not because pain vanishes, but because the mind no longer wraps it in stories of me and mine, of failure or fate. And in this spacious clarity, we find a joy that does not depend on conditions, a peace that moves like water around rocks, fluid, quiet, and unbreakable. And in that peace, we recognize others not as threats, not as competitors, not even as strangers, but as fellow travelers caught in the same illusions, searching for the same freedom. And with that recognition comes boundless compassion, the kind that expects nothing in return, the kind that gives without clinging, that acts without self-congratulation, that sees no difference between the hand that offers and the hand that receives. And so what Buddha says becomes not just a refuge for ourselves, but a bridge for others. And as we depend in this path, our presence itself becomes a form of practice. How we sit, how we listen, how we forgive, these become acts of service, of remembrance, of awakening. And the deeper we go, the more we realize that this path has no end point, no finish line to cross. For awakening is not a singular achievement, but an ongoing unfolding, a spiral that brings us back again and again to the present moment with new eyes, new humility, new love. And the more we surrender to this unfolding, the more we see that there is nothing to defend, nothing to prove, nothing to become. Because we are already the space in which all things arise and pass, and Buddha's wisdom begins to shine from within us, not as borrowed knowledge, but as direct knowing, a quiet confidence rooted in awareness. And in that awareness we become resilient, not rigid, but like bamboo, bending without breaking, firm without force, rooted without resistance. And our lives begin to reflect what Buddha said, not because we memorize his words, but because we've touched the same truth that he did, that freedom is possible, that compassion is natural, and that suffering is optional when seen through the lens of wisdom. And so the journey is no longer about self-improvement, but about self-liberation, not about becoming more, but about recognizing what was never needed. And as the dust of our illusion settles, the mind clears like a still pond. And in that stillness we meet the world again, not as a battlefield, but as a field of practice, of presence, of potential, where even difficulty becomes a teacher, even pain becomes a portal, and even endings become new beginnings. And this is the heart of the Buddha's message, that nothing is fixed, everything flows. And when we stop fighting the current, we discover that it carries us towards something vast, kind, and deeply true, not separate from us, but arising within us, as us, in every mindful step, every gentle breath, and every loving glance. And in this unfolding, the Dharma is no longer a path we walk. It becomes the way we walk all paths, with eyes open, with heart open, with arms wide enough to embrace it all. And as we now draw gently toward the end of this contemplative journey through what Buddha says, we realize that the path he laid out was never meant to end in words, or even in silence, but in direct experience, in the way we live, in how we show up for life with our whole being, and in how we transform suffering not by resisting it, but by meeting it with the open eyes of wisdom and the open arms of compassion. And as this truth settles more deeply into our awareness, we see that Buddha's teachings were never about worshipping an icon or building grand philosophies. They were always about awakening, about freedom, about seeing things as they are, and living from that truth with integrity, kindness, and clarity. And so now, when we remember what Buddha says, we no longer look only to the ancient texts or marble statues, but to the movement of our own breath, to the rise and fall of thought, to the kindness of a stranger, to the impermanence of a leaf, to the silence between heartbeats, and we realize that the Dharma lives not only in monasteries or forests, but in traffic jams, dinner tables, hospital rooms, classrooms, and city streets, wherever one person chooses awareness over reaction, presence over distraction, and love over fear. And with that realization, our practice becomes life itself, not something separate, not something sacred only when sitting on a cushion, but something as ordinary and holy as washing a ball, smiling at a child, offering a hand to someone who's fallen. And as we embody this, we become lights in a darkening world, not because we're trying to shine, but because we've stopped covering the light that was always there, and in that quiet radiance, others begin to remember their own light. And in this way, the teachings continue, not frozen in time, but moving like a river, flowing from heart to heart, breath to breath, moment to moment, evolving with each new soul who takes up the path, not as followers, but as fellow awakeners. Each of us a reflection of that original flame that still burns from the moment Buddha sat beneath the Bodhi tree and vowed not to rise until he had seen through the final veil of illusion, and in honoring that vow, he lit a fire that has never gone out, and now it burns in us too, in our seeking, in our questions, in our efforts to live more mindfully, to love more fully, to forgive more quickly, to see more clearly, and to be present in this fleeting life, not as victims of its uncertainty, but as pilgrims of its beauty. And now, as we take a long breath and carry these teachings into our daily steps, may we not only remember what Buddha says, but may we live it, share it, and become it, not in words alone, but in the quiet, steady flame of awakened presence that asks for nothing and gives everything, simply because that is what love does, and that is what awakening looks like, and that, truly, is what Buddha says. Thank you for being here, for listening, for reflecting. If this touched your heart, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. Until next time, stay mindful, stay kind, and keep walking the path within.